for joining. So we have a full agenda today, and so I'm going to just get going. And could you, in the meantime, in chat, put your name and affiliation, just so people can get to know each other in the Zoom room as you filter in. Mahalo. Okay, so I'm going to start. So, when Gay and I sort of fashioned this series, of course, the Arts Alliance did some polling and found out from all of you that really strategy around advocacy has been missing from the sort of the training offerings. And so I thought I would take a stab at putting something together that helps, I don't know, provide some frameworks for how you might do this. And I know that what's hard about this work, and I want to qualify that I know that some of you are individual artists, some of you are teachers, artists in the schools, and some of you are running and managing nonprofits that whose missions focus on the arts. And so the content today is a little bit of everything, but it's mostly geared to nonprofit arts organizations. So I will try to sort of keep it applicable to all of you as I go along. And feel free to ask questions at any time. This is meant to be very collaborative and more of a discussion. I will whip through some of these slides. I do have a lot to get through, and Robert does have some very critical information for you around compliance in the end. So, okay. So one of the things that often is missing, as I was saying, is just starting with a good strategic approach to your policy or your advocacy work. And we sometimes don't have the luxury to think about it in this way because there might be a threat that crops up at the Capitol in the form of a dangerous bill that threatens your mission. And you're just sort of asked to go down there and start, sort of advocating for what you stand for without really a lot of sense about how this would make sense for your work or make sense for your organization. So we're taking a couple steps back and we're imagining that we're threat free at the moment and we have all the time in the world to actually plan for our advocacy work. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Oops. Okay. There we go. I'm going to go over, so today's session 1 is going to really be talking very quickly about building the case of advocacy, which I know many of you, don't need a whole lot of convincing. You're doing this work already, but we're also going to create some strategy around this work, and then we're going to get ourselves ready, whether it's ourselves as individuals, as teachers, or as nonprofit organizations. And then, as I mentioned, Robert's going to go through state compliances in particular, ethics commission um, laws. And then we'll have hopefully some time at the end for Q&A and discussion for both Robert and myself. Okay, this is not advancing. Okay.
Lisa, try the space bar.
Yes, there we go. All right. I'm going to speed it up here. Okay. Again, this, you don't need convincing, I know, but here are just some examples of some movements over time, right? Some that took longer to achieve their goals, and some that were, again, in the wake of like a critical disaster like the Red Hill water contamination. So, why advocacy? This is just what we do, in what is, what we've known to be a democracy in our country. But the work that we do in this way, it changes how we live and what we believe. It allows us to stand for our missions. It protects our well-being and rights, and it gives voice and representation to the voiceless, particularly the work that we're doing in the nonprofit sector here in Hawaii. Okay. This is just an example of why public policies and tracking public policies matter. This is an example of two countries and a demarcation line where the left side is a country that doesn't have laws that actually protect, they're actually encouraging deforestation versus the right side that does, um, protect deforestation. So just this is just a stark visual example of why public policies matter and why we should be tracking them. And then I thought that there's often, when we're talking about this work, there's often confusion um, around the definitions. We use them interchangeably. We say, hey, are you going to, some of us are called public policy directors, but we're really doing more than just tracking public policy, right? So advocacy is the term that's sort of the umbrella term for the broad work in this arena. Public policy is what government does. It's choosing to legislate, create measures that regulate or have stipulate funding priorities or stipulate other types of actions to solve problems. So that's, public policy. And then lobbying is the act of promoting, opposing, or otherwise influencing that legislation or any regulatory policies or other government actions through communications with public officials. There are different types of lobbyists. There are individual volunteer, people who are just, maybe outraged citizens who want to participate in the legislative process and will show up for a hearing. They're not getting paid, they're doing it out of their own accord. And then there are those that are being compensated through, say, their salary, say at a nonprofit like Gay. Gay gets paid to do some of this work, but she does a lot of other work as an executive director for her organization. And then there are professional lobbyists that get compensated for just doing lobbying and they have multiple clients. But there are many different ways of engaging in lobbying, and there are different regulations that monitor each of those types of lobbyists. So, okay, I think it's really important when you have the luxury to kind of think about these things about what really is your theory of change. If you were really not always on the defense and having to just sort of show up at the Capitol and kill bad bills, you're actually wanting to be proactive and introduce bills, introduce legislation that actually challenges or supports your theory of change. And so really asking yourselves, what is the theory of change that I'm working on? And how will that change occur? What are some interim measurable outcomes that I can tell if I'm making a difference? And what is really the long-term outcomes that I'm working toward? How will I know that I've actually affected my theory of change? And what role do I play or does my organization play in achieving that? And what are the activities that I'm going to do to actually engage in these goals and achieve these outcomes? Okay, so it's relatively simple, but certainly in the nonprofit sector, we struggle with these questions a lot when we're doing strategic planning. And often when we are doing organizational strategic planning, the advocacy strategic plan is often missing. And so it's really good to kind of do these things at the same time and ask these questions, not just of your larger organizational mission activities, but specifically around your advocacy work. Okay, so what is, let's take a guess, like, and if some of you are not so shy, you could call it out, or you could put it in the chat. But what would you say is a theory of change for increasing the appreciation for the arts? Does anybody want to take a stab at a statement that is the theory of change for increasing our appreciation for the arts? And I can't see the chat at the moment, so um, Gay, if you could monitor if anybody's if they're
Yes.
venturing to answer this question.
None yet. No one is, everyone's shy
Oh, brave
this
at
afternoon.
that. Okay, give it
Lisa, I
time.
could throw out
Yes, please.
maybe an example. So, that all young people and beyond have access to arts education or arts enrichment could be a theory of change. It's certainly one that I believe is important. Um, could that serve as an
Yes,
example?
absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, good one. Uh, my good friend ChatGPT weighed in on this one, and Chat's theory of change is it's like a problem statement, and it is art is undervalued in education, policy, and culture, leading to inequitable access, reduced creativity, and limited recognition of its role in civic and personal development. So that's the theory of change that Chat came up with. So just giving you a sense of how you might formulate these statements to have a theory of change and how you might use them in articulating this to stakeholders outside of your organization or even engaging board members, hiring staff. I mean, if you can kind of say this, it helps everyone to march sort of toward the same goals. If you're a teacher, you can have this conversation with your colleagues, with your administration, with parents around the kind of work you're doing in art education, et cetera. Okay. Okay, this is a fun, one of my favorite matrices, and it's created by the Center for Evaluation Innovation out of the Johns Hopkins Center for Public Policy or Center for Civic Engagement or something like that. But what I love about this matrix is it's not linear. You'll notice that the y-x-axis is measuring the type of audience that's going to be hearing or experiencing your work. And on the y-axis, it measures the outcomes or the desires that the action that you would like to see. And so, as you can tell, it's not like you start in this corner where you start in this corner and you work your way up or across. You can start really anywhere, but it gives you a really, I guess, comprehensive understanding of the different types of methods of advocacy work that you could do to achieve your outcomes. And, if you want to start with a public awareness campaign, you're going to be engaging the broadest audience of the public, but you're really just creating general awareness. You're not necessarily asking people to go your way or to make a definitive decision about anything. You're just getting information out there to kind of slowly change, provide the enough education to slowly change people's ideas or values or behaviors around your mission work, right? Um, and then that might lay uh, the foundation for, say, if you wanted to do coalition building or you wanted to do um, litigation or something like that, or you wanted to do model legislation, you're building some foundational interest in the general public to actually, when you say you do an action alert, you call everybody down to the Capitol, at least you have a good group of people who understand where you're coming from. So there's different things here around this chart, but it really gives you a good sense, not just of where you could start. You could start anywhere again, but also like where are your stakeholder and your partner organizations? Where are they doing work? So you can actually kind of put identify your positionality vis-a-vis some of your other partners or even those organizations that oppose the work that you're doing. You can position them in these places to understand what a good strategy to inform your strategy for your work. Um, this is also a great way to talk with funders about your work. It helps them to have a nice framework and understanding where you're doing the work. And also, I think the funding community really understands that if you're beginning your advocacy work in year one, you may not pull out model legislation in year one, or you may not take someone to court in year one. But to articulate that in year one, you might be building partnerships, you might be building up the skills on your staff, you might be recruiting the right board members. And when you talk about it that way with funders, they understand that those are as I said before, those are the intermediate or the short term outcomes that you're working for that are really building the foundation for longer term successes. So And I have found that funders are willing to fund in that intermediate space to get you, to give you the capacity to be able to succeed in the other spaces. Any questions about this matrix at this point in time? Okay. And Gay, you'll let me know if there are any questions popping up in the chat box.
Yes, I
Okay,
will.
thank you. Okay.
Mhm.
So we'll just carry on. So what this is just sort of part of the why, and this is for oftentimes I've trained on this with particularly nonprofit organizations that are a little reticent, little hesitant to go into this arena, but really need to. Their missions are missing in the conversation in these spaces, but they're a little scared. And so this slide is really to say these are ways in which your organization can really flourish and grow in ways that you could have never imagined because you're doing this kind of work. You have the ability to recruit new and different staff and different board members. You can attract different partners than you ever have and new funders. You can, of course, stand for your mission, which is really one of the most important things. And you can you can participate in systems change. And why this kind of matters, and the next slide is, hold on. This is a slide out of a book by an author, David Stroh, and the book is called Systems Thinking for Social Change. And what this funny little cartoon kind of purports is that oftentimes, and this is very common in the nonprofit sector, is we tend to really keep our heads down and we work on community in the ways that we really can only see. And so we might be, in community, and in this case, it's the elephant, and we might be at the top. And so we think that from our vantage point, the top of the elephant's head is a fan, and somebody might be working on the trunk and saying, we're working on a snake, right? And then the side, people working on the side, we're working on a wall. And oftentimes, what that translates to in our community based work is we tend to sometimes be myopic, and we really, because we see it so close, we're really identifying the problem maybe incorrectly because we're not seeing the bigger system that we're operating in, and we're not really striving to solve for the root issues of that system, such that sometimes the mission work that we're doing might be undermining our neighbor who's working on the tail or working on, the tusks kind of thing. So, um, these little orange bubbles really are reminding us that when we prepare for the advocacy work, we have to we have to remember to not work in silos, to not be myopic as much as possible, to ask the right questions about the theory of change, right? Like what are we actually trying to solve for? We have to reduce our independence on the quick fix, and we tend to fall in those traps because sometimes we chase the money. We are looking for the government contract, we're looking for the quick fix. And so we might tend to look for solutions that are very, very short term, that kind of inhibit our ability to really work on the root issues over the long term. So it's about creating instead a vision, an alternate vision for the future. So it's not um, the usual stuff, but it's imagining, a different world that doesn't have this problem. And then what would it take? What types of investments have to be made in order to achieve that new solution? And then being able to really articulate this vision to external stakeholders, your partners, your funders, et cetera. And I will say that since I was previously at HANO, the Hawaii Alliance of Nonprofit Organization, for many years, and now I'm doing some facilitative work with philanthropic organizations. And so for the first time in my career, I'm really walking in funder shoes. And it's been an interesting journey for me after being so embedded in the nonprofit, 501(c)(3) charitable serving sector for all my career, to really hear their pain points. And they really appreciate when a nonprofit comes to them with this larger systems vision and then is able to articulate where their work is in that bigger elephant work. Instead of coming in, they often see people, organizations coming in piecemeal and sometimes undermining the others, right? And so for the funder, it's kind of frustrating to see those types of applications coming in that are very myopic. And so just a reminder, this is something, and this really, if you understand the system that you want to work in and the solutions that you want to solve, create, then it informs the advocacy work clearly, right? And then it's easier to get the momentum and pick up the right support and partners that you need. Okay, so just some examples of this. Systems thinking for your theory of change. So examples from other parts of the sector, addressing prison recidivism and working to build supportive communities for reentry. We find that because there isn't a lot to receive these um, people that are being released from prison, like job training and life skills, they flounder and fail, and then they head back into prison, because they aren't given a lot of other choices. And so, how about building a broader system of care for them? Reducing drunk driving and solving for the deeper issues around substance use, asking those deeper questions around that. And then feeding the hungry and looking at the root issues of poverty that actually contribute to hunger, right? So let's move to arts. Let's ask another question of you, shy group. Um, for advocacy in the arts, what would be a systems level solution? Feel free to call it out or put it in the chat.
So Lisa, chat is quiet right now, but I'll try to toss out another
Everybody is so
example.
shy today. Okay,
Maybe more in a listening mode, and that's perfectly fine.
sure.
But thinking about the that theory of change earlier, and I
Uh-huh.
was talking about arts education.
Right,
One possibility is just going higher, starting with the Department of Education to talk about the importance of arts education, to see what maybe the challenges or pain points are at
right.
that system level. That might help us to solve for having arts education or arts enrichment at a minimum in all schools across
Absolutely.
the island. So that could be one way of going higher, going upstream to
Definitely.
address the system level challenges.
Love it. Love it. Thank you. Yes. Any others want to take a stab at this or sharing something from your world? And if people are really struggling with the concept of what systems level is, feel free to ask that question too. Okay, well, we'll move on. This is my friend, my buddy Chat's answer about what a systems level sort of statement might be. Over the next 5 years, building a statewide ecosystem that positions the arts as integral to education, health, and economic systems, measured by policy adoption, cross-sector partnerships, and increased arts literacy across generations. It's very lofty. It's very big thinking, but it sure is a systems level statement about what should happen. So smart guy or gal, probably a gal, Chat GPT. Okay, getting ready, getting your organization or your team or yourself ready. This is again geared toward the nonprofit context. And so it's really about making sure you have the right board members on your board, staff as well, making sure that your board has an advocacy or a policy committee, and that committee really understands the role that they're going to play. So an example of that is You know, if there's a threat to the organization, is the board being asked to go down to the Capitol to actually testify? Or is the board, what role does the board play in this work, right? Is the board going to make the rounds on opening day, or is the board going to, just, and then as volunteers of the organization, really understanding the risks to that, as well as, the impact it could have for board members to play that role, but just really making those expectations clear of board members who sit on this committee. And then an advocacy statement as part of the organization's vision statement. And this could also be the case for teachers. This could also be the case for administrators at schools, et cetera, around the work that you're going to do. Parents, the PTA, that might be the nonprofit arm attached to the school environment, et cetera. Sometimes state employees, Robert could probably speak to this more clearly, they're prohibited from doing some of this work, or there is a chain of command around, um, you know, voicing things at the legislature. And so sometimes government workers at schools are not able to be as vocal, but certainly the charitable entity that's affiliated with the organization can. So then also just asking yourself, do we have the money to do this work? We're so busy devoting time to programmatic deliverables, et cetera. In these times with the federal cuts, money is tight. Can we afford a staff person? Can we afford a lobbyist on the external, et cetera? So just asking yourself, and where's the funding coming from for this? Is there an interested group of external corporate or whatever who are willing to support this work? Um, Understanding the implications of doing this work. So if you are playing the role of an advocate, you are sometimes maybe criticizing your government counterparts or something for what's not happening. There's not enough art in public schools, or there's not enough activities, et cetera. So if you're showing up and you're challenging notions, prevailing thinking, but then at the same time, you might be asking for support for this work or even other parts of your organization. It's good to have an honest conversation at the board level around the risks of doing this type of work. And can you afford to be sticking your neck out, right? And all that entails. And then creating talking points for any external or even an internal stakeholder to understand where the organization is on this. And all of these tips feel very simple, but trust me, it makes so much of a difference to actually be really thoughtful about each of these pieces in getting your organization ready to do this work well. Okay. And then here are examples of advocacy statements that you could embed in any of your values documents, not so much your mission, but probably your vision, or it can be a companion statement that goes out with all your documents. It could be on your website, et cetera. It could be in your annual report. But around advocacy, these are just some, again, Smart Chat came up with these different examples of advocacy statements around the arts. You could make it Hawaiian rooted and values based. You could do a civic and policy forward type statement. You could talk about community empowerment. Or you could talk about advocacy as a shared responsibility. So these are just some samples that you could draw from in kind of creating your own statements that are meaningful to you and the work that you're doing. Okay. And then some tactical questions. So we're kind of moving out of strategy now, and this is like the day-to-day stuff that you're doing to prepare for this work. Tactical questions to ask yourself, what activities are we going to focus on? What alliances and new partnerships could we forge? Who might oppose this work? It's sort of doing like an environmental landscape scan of who's out there and who might be upset by the work that you're doing. What will the repercussions be? And is there funding for this work? We talked about that earlier. Does my organization have the internal capacity? Are the right skills on staff? are the right staff on the bus for this work? How are we going to evaluate this? And again, that Center for Evaluation Innovation is a great resource. Later, I can put that URL in the chat to actually help you to evaluate, not only evaluate the work, set up mechanisms of measurement before you even start this work so that you can articulate sort of baseline um, changes to the baseline and articulate that to your funders. But it's also just how do you want to talk about it in incremental stages to anyone who's interested, right? And so chunking out the work in sort of an evaluative uh, context. And then do you have the data and the stories to share around the impact that you're, the movement, right? Are you able to tell this in qualitative and quantitative ways to be compelling, to move people from point A to point B? And what is your positionality? What's the role that your organization is going to play vis-a-vis, another organization that's taking a different stance or a slightly modified position? Sometimes the work is very nuanced. And so just really making sure that you're clear about where your organization sits and its purpose and its strategies. And then what's your story? So if you're an organization, are you the teacher? Are you going to ask for testimonies from children? Are you going to look to the parent groups? Are you the nonprofit employee? Sometimes one or the other is more compelling in the storytelling to get people to go your way. And then can you sustain this? And a lot of nonprofits struggle with this over time. They kind of come out hitting hard and then lose funding for it in 2 years, and then they start sputtering and slow down, or they might lose a really skilled staff person and then it takes them back a couple steps. And it's really hard to sustain that excellence over time. So a good strategy around this, a good sustainability plan around this is really needed. Uh, Okay, I think I will stop here before we head to Robert Harris's piece. Um, I just want to stop and see if there are any, I'm gonna stop share. Any questions? And, no scared, just seriously, no question is dumb or new, really. This is new work, I think, in community-based organizations and in the arts, it is also pretty new for a lot of people. So really don't feel we started with a kind of a sophisticated topic, if you will. It's hard to get people's head wrapped around that. But oftentimes, as I said, we're often starting with the strategy too late, and then we're not being very strategic, right? So I'll stop. Any questions?
Lisa, nothing in the chat. I do want to just toss out one resource if people would like to learn more about that system level thinking, which I think is such a powerful component of all this. And there's a wonderful book called Upstream by Dan Heath. And I'm happy to add that to the chat. It's a great resource on really getting our minds around going up the chain to see where we can address challenges at a higher level. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation.
Sure. Okay, well, we'll let Robert Harris, Executive Director of the Hawaii State Ethics Commission, do his thing now and, talk about complexity. We'll continue on this theme. Take it away, Robert. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you, Gay, for the invitation to be here. Can I just confirm you guys can hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Let me just start first by maybe introducing myself briefly. I am the former executive director of the Sierra Club. I started as a volunteer through college and through law school. So I have a lot of aloha and fondness for advocacy, grassroots advocacy, and have a sincere appreciation for the fact that good policy isn't made without a strong voice representing the people, representing sort of, diverse interests. Because without sort of this level of advocacy, essentially the only voices that get represented are those that can pay for it. And, that's not necessarily good policymaking for the entire state. So I am here to talk about lobbying generally, and I want to make a couple of distinctions. And so first, I'll make a distinction that there's no such thing as good or bad lobbying. Lots of people just instinctively abhor the title lobbyist. In fact, for a long time, I always called myself an advocacy. I didn't do lobbying, I did advocacy. But for purpose of this discussion, it's important that I go through what the legal term is for lobbying, and we talk about it in a little bit more depth. And again, there's no such thing as good or bad lobbying. In fact, I don't think you can get good legislation done on any level without lobbyists being involved. If you're trying to pass healthcare law, for example, you're going to need to have hospitals and doctors and different interests represented. If you're going to pass education, you kind of go through the list of different areas, and the importance of having experts in the room talking about their expertise. The central purpose of these state lobbying laws, and we see similar ones at a federal level, is for transparency. It isn't to restrict, punish, or do anything generally more significantly, except to allow both the public, allow legislators, and sort of in the broader context of different stakeholders to know who is spending money to advocate or influence policy. So it is 95% transparency and sort of just disclosure. And so again, being defined, at least on a state level, as a lobbyist, I hope, if I can caution and sort of encourage, is not necessarily a bad thing. It is simply an opportunity to make sure there's disclosure. And again, if you're trying to push for a particular law and there's somebody on the other side pushing against you, you can certainly understand why you sort of want to know, okay, wait, who's paying you? Where's the money coming from? And it's just disclosure. Let me make another sort of disclaimer, and maybe something we'll circle back to later. There are two different uses when you start talking about lobbying. I am going to talk about it principally from a state perspective. What do I need to do if I am a lobbyist? What do I need to do? When am I a lobbyist? How am I a lobbyist, et cetera? And we're just going to talk about those base requirements. Many nonprofits, particularly 501c3s, have concerns about the IRS tax implications of doing lobbying. Again, two different terms when you talk about it from a tax perspective. What is lobbying? What is advocacy? Versus what you're doing at the state level and what triggers a lobbying law. I just want to be very clear, they're different. And I think what you can do to stay within the 501c3, we can circle back to later. For now, I'm just going to simply say, hey, if you're doing these types of activities, you may be a lobbyist. And if so, what do you need to do? Okay. So I have curtailed our normal presentation lobbying to try to be as focused as possible, specifically to the people who are here. But in the process of doing that, I may skip some things. And so feel free to raise your hand or sort of ask background questions, because again, I'm, for the sake of simplicity and time, trying to be focused. So first question that I think everyone's going to be interested in knowing is who has to register as a lobbyist? Am I a lobbyist? Do I have to register? So let's go through the different factors we look at. First, who are you talking to? If you're talking to the legislature, the governor or the governor's office, or a state agency, it's one factor. You need to meet them all. Second, are you talking about legislation or administrative rules? If you're talking about anything else, you're not a lobbyist. And then the third factor, it's probably the most important factor, is are you being paid to lobby on behalf of someone else? So again, speaking to, and just being very simplistic, a legislator to talk about a legislation, and you're being paid to do it. And that include your own employment. So if you are an employee of an organization and you are testifying on behalf of that organization, or during that organization's time using their money, et cetera, and be paid to do that, that is sufficient to trigger the lobbying requirements. So if you're an individual testifying and saying, hey, I think we need to support more education specific to arts, and every school should have education specific to arts, and you're testifying your individual capacity, not a lobbyist. On the other hand, if you're working for an advocacy group or a 501c3, and it's part of your position to make these arguments, then you may fit within the lobbying definition. I have more and sort of what other factors, but let me just pause there and see if there's any specific questions as to this. Okay, must mean it's as clear as glass. So there's a threshold. So not even if you may potentially trigger the lobbying, you still have to do a certain amount of lobbying activity to have to register and report. And it is admittedly a very low standard. In the 1970s, they didn't have standards and everyone felt like they had to register. And so in response to that, they set a deliberately low bar just to kind of say like just incidental conversations weren't enough. So you either have to be, let's start with the time. You have to be lobbying for more than 5 hours in a month or 10 hours in a year, or you have to have spent or been paid more than $1,000 in a year or reporting period. So these are sort of low thresholds, but the idea is incidental conversations may not be enough. And then what qualifies as, well, we'll get back to what qualifies from a time perspective, but there are some specific exceptions. The media do not need to register a report. A nonprofit grant and aid, if you're submitting an application, you essentially get 10 hours for free. If you go above the 10 hours, now you've met the reporting requirement. And then federal, state, or county employees do not have to register unless they hire their own outside lobbyist. Just within the definition, private citizens just don't meet the requirement, but we are really trying to hit that, make sure everyone understands that. And then an attorney talking to their client or something, or submitting a report doesn't trigger the requirement. Okay, so let's talk about time. Time includes drafting and submitting testimony, meeting with legislators or state officials about proposed bills or rules, and actively waiting to testify. You theoretically could be doing something else while you're waiting, like if you're doing something online, but if you're just sitting there waiting, that's still considered lobbying time. And again, this is kind of going into that. Now, one other thing that's pretty important I really want to cover, we also include indirect lobbying. So this is what I would call is grassroots activism, sort of at the baseline. If you are emailing your supporters, your members, and actively telling them contact Senator so-and-so, that is also time for purposes of the lobbying, because you are indirectly telling, instead of me talking to the senator, I am telling someone else to go talk to the senator. So it's that indirect pass-through is still considered time for purposes of lobbying and expenditures for purposes of lobbying. Again, you still have to meet all the other requirements. It has to be about legislation. It has to be on behalf of someone else. You have to be paid. But assuming you meet those requirements, the time and stuff spent in these types of email advocacy campaigns is also something that may be reported in a lobbying report. Let me pause there. Any questions? I'm going to quickly take a glance at the chat if I can. Oh, I guess I can't see it. Sorry. This is one that I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand or know. So that's why I'm sort of harping on it. And it may be sort of the one that applies to grassroots organizations the most. But you can also imagine sort of a fake, they used to call them astroturf organizations, where really it's just trying to drive the perception that a lot of people support or oppose something. Also, the money spent on that type of activity would be reported. And that would give legislators the opportunity to understand, oh, they spent $1 million to buy a voter list, for example. This doesn't feel as real as maybe a real organization that has 50 or 60 years of history in the community. Gay, did something pop up in the chat?
Yes, let me take a quick look here. We do have a question. Is it a generally good idea to simply track all time spent lobbying. That way the data is available when needed. That's from Paul I. Lincoln.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think if you meet the foundational requirements, then absolutely, I would say yes. And there's an obligation to register. And again, I sort of took some of the stuff out of order, so we might get into it if we keep going down through the PowerPoints, to register within 5 days after you triggered the threshold. So you should be pretty much aware, hey, I've clearly gone beyond 5 hours. What do we do to sort of enforce that or police that? I mean, we do review testimony submitted, and we are going to review, hey, if John Doe submitted 10 pieces of testimony on a bill on behalf of someone else, chances are they probably passed the number of hours we're going to start calling and asking. So, yes, you should try to track it. And I think it's just a smart idea. In addition, we really try to encourage people to register, and we have a lot of lobbyists who register and in several years don't actually meet the requirements. The reporting obligation is pretty minimal. If you have 0 to report, you literally have to log in, click a button, and you're done. The idea is we sort of want you in the fold, and then on some year suddenly something blows up, you're already registered. It's okay. It's easy to kind of report those additional hours that year. Let me keep going on a little bit because there's a couple of other small requirements. I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of it, and then can sort of pause and search just open up for questions generally. Maybe we can all unmute at that time. Some other exceptions. So if you're just generally researching or having discussions about a bill that you think might be nice to be introduced someday, but it doesn't actually, there's no reasonable likelihood it's going to be introduced in a year, it doesn't count. Or working on a legislative or administrative task force doesn't count. If you're doing just background, and you're doing it on behalf of another lobbyist, you're not actually communicating to the legislature. The idea is that that lobbyist you're working for is the one who's going to be reporting it, and you yourself don't have to. This applies a lot of times to like larger organizations or larger lobbying firms, for example. They'll have people hired that don't actually do any of the communication. So we have a question. John is employed as a program director for Save Something. He just launched a social media campaign urging the public to call their legislators to support a bill to ban plastic and disposable food containers. John has worked over 40 hours on this campaign. Does John need to register as a lobbyist? Show of hands, yes. Got a few, okay. Anybody say no? Okay, yeah, so I mean, he is being paid. It's a social media campaign urging the public to contact the legislator. So it's that indirect lobbying that we talked about earlier. And it's clearly over 40 hours. So this is something that would be reportable. Okay. Martina works for ABC Corp, doing background research in opposition to HB 529's proposed corporate tax increases. She's invested 20 hours of her time, or about 2,500. Martina's boss, the VP of Government Relations, is already registered. Does Martina need to register as well? Anybody have a guess and want to go off mute and answer this one?
Aloha, this is Lisa Louise. I think Martina only needs to register if she is going to lobby herself, but if just her boss is lobbying, she does not need to register.
Yeah, that's right. She's not communicating with the legislature. So she's doing the background research. She hasn't actually talked to anybody about it. Her time would need to be reported. So her boss, who is doing the actual communication, would report that time or thing within their report. But Martina herself doesn't have to register. Great. Again, I'm kind of skimming through this because I want to sort of be respectful of time and just leave some time for Q&A. So again, basic requirements are registration. You're going to report the number of hours, and there's reporting periods. Once you've registered, we will bombard you with email. I say that jokingly, but we'll give you lots of notice about when the reporting deadlines are coming up. And then we have a new requirement that lobbyists have to go through a training. It is a online training now that we do, self-directed. You can do it at any time, and it's going to look pretty familiar to what you're seeing right now. And so it's just a requirement you have to do in order to register. And then there are some small restrictions, and let's just talk about those really quick, and then I'm going to pause. Okay, so like I said, must complete training before registration. Restrictions include contingency fee-based lobbying, campaign donations during session, and a lobbying gift ban. So contingency fee lobbying is basically saying, hey, pay me this much if I pass the bill. We generally have just sort of prohibited that because we think it impacts the objectiveness of a lobbyist and sort of encourages maybe overt shenanigans that shouldn't be allowed. So the idea is, lobbyists can be paid, any other way based on, hours worked or monthly compensation, et cetera. But you can't say it's based on my ability to pass a law or not pass a law. This is a relatively new restriction. So if you are registered as a lobbyist, you are not allowed to make a campaign contribution during a legislative session or 5 days before or after. The intent is to prohibit somebody from kind of walking in right before a vote and saying, hey, I'd love to make a $2,000 campaign contribution to you as a means to influence that vote, or even the appearance of that being an influence. So that is one of the key restrictions now of being registered as lobbyists, is you now have that prohibition during that period of time. And a lot of legislators sort of in response are now just not accepting any donations during the legislative session, which I think is probably inherently a good thing. And then lobbyists are not allowed to offer gifts to state employees that are prohibited by the gifts law. General idea is state employees aren't supposed to accept certain types of gifts, and similarly, lobbyists aren't allowed to offer or give those type of gifts. We can get into a little bit more detail of what that means, but just generally speaking, there are some exceptions that are allowed, and if you have questions, feel free to contact us and ask. But generally speaking, if you're a lobbyist, you're not supposed to be giving gifts to legislators. Okay, and then we have some general just slides on registration. But what I'm going to do is just go ahead and skip to sort of generally what's included in an expenditure report, which includes the sum expended for the purpose of lobbying. And a lot of times that's just generally speaking going to be somebody's salary. If, for example, you are paid, say, $10 million, we can all hope, and 10% of your time spent in lobbying, we would do math and we would figure out what 10% of $10 million is, and that's what we would report. Generally speaking, as long as you're doing a good faith estimation of the time you spent and how much is being spent on it, generally speaking, we're not going to dig much further than that. But the idea is it's something you should be tracking and sort of aware of, with the idea that you're able to make a cognitive, rationale of why you're reporting that amount. Advertising, research and poll, fees paid to lobbyists, while discussing lobbying strategy, et cetera, and then time spent waiting to testify is sort of as, the time spent is all stuff that would be put in an expenditure report. Travel, but not inter-island. The idea is we try to allow the neighbor islands to participate equally, so that they can come to the capital if they wish. This obviously a law passed in the 1970s before a lot of the online testimony, but the idea is we didn't want to put them on a different footing, so we don't require interstate travel to be reported. But if you're flying in from the mainland or flying to the mainland for this, it would be reported. And then this doesn't happen very often, but if you're like printing a really significantly big binder of information and you're providing that to legislators, that may be reported as a sort of thing that you're spending to give to legislators, or the aggregate amount that is spent over $150. I think I'm going to just pause there and basically be available for questions. I have other examples and other things. But let me leave up our contact information just for a second, see if anybody wants to ask a question. Again, I think lobbying is the grease that makes the legislative world work. And so try to view, obviously there's types of lobbying activity we may not necessarily like or agree with. But the important thing is sort of making sure it's a system that works for everybody, making sure there's transparency for everybody. Let me talk about maybe a couple things I kind of anticipated as questions coming up from this this group. Let's imagine somebody is a solo artist and they're submitting testimony, as a private citizen. Obviously, we've covered quite well that is not a lobbyist. Now, let's say they're a solo artist doing business as a DBA, like they have a doing business as, so they sell under Hawaii Sunset Arts, but they are still a solo artist. They don't employ anybody, they don't hire anybody. Typically, we're not going to treat that as somebody who's being paid to lobby. Although I think as a good practice, I would suggest testifying as John Doe or Jane Doe, who does business as Hawaii Sunset Arts, submits this testimony. The idea that you're still trying to indicate you're essentially an individual or solo person. Let's do another example. Let's say it's a 5-person hui or 5-person group that gets together to advocate for more education in the arts. And each of those 5 people are paid to do that work, even if it's by someone else. And they're testifying on behalf of that hui. Then typically we're going to say that you're being paid to lobby, and that you're going to have to report either the hui, and the hui would report its total expenditures, and you'd probably show the contributions from each individual's organization that's paying them to do the work, or it's going to be reported by their organization. So as an example, I used to do work for a solar company. We worked with other solar companies and we formed an advocacy organization. I was paid by my solar company to do the work. The advocacy organization reported the time that I was working on advocacy as a contribution, and it was all reflective of the idea that anybody who looked up the work that I did or work the organization did could see the amount spent and the amount paid. So a couple examples I'm hoping that might be useful. Any questions? Maybe I provoked something. Lisa, do you want to talk briefly about 501c3 questions?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. I was just going to say that the state, as Robert has outlined, has very specific laws around reporting and compliance. And then, of course, for those of you who have 501c3 organizations, everyone has to file with the IRS on an annual basis, our 990 forms. There is a, I think it's called Schedule C, that's an attachment to your 990 that actually reports the time that you're spending around advocacy work. But it's defined, unfortunately, it's defined differently from how it is defined and broken down at the state level, as well as the county level. So the IRS sort of divvies the sort of duties up differently, right? So if you are taking time to get a e-blast out to your membership to let them know that there is a bill being heard at the Capitol, the IRS defines that as just sort of getting information out, like grassroots lobbying. And then the direct lobbying expense relates to the testimony and the ask, right? If you're asking someone to oppose or to support the bill, that is direct lobbying. And so it's just being mindful and careful of the different definitions of the different entities, federal, state, county. They have different filing deadlines, of course. County is similar to state. It's usually the first 5 days within the beginning of the year to file your annual report for the year prior and to register. The counties do require you as well to register with them, most of the counties. And they're slightly different from one to the other. So I just would caution you to just look carefully at those different regulations. The IRS does have a form called a 501H, which is confusing because it kind of sounds like 501c3. But the 501H election is a very simple form that is it's literally like the name of the organization, the address, and the tax ID number. And that's all you're doing is saying to the IRS, hey, we're heads up, we're going to be doing advocacy work. And it is a best practice to file this form. It's a one-time filing in perpetuity. So if you file it today, your organization has this form filed in perpetuity forever, unless you, what do you call, like, cancel it, right? With, your organization closes its doors or something like that. But and I can put the 501H election form in the chat. If you look at the National Council of Nonprofit link that I gave you, there you can understand, it tells you a little bit more about the purpose of the 501H form, and then I think it takes you directly to a link to the form itself. So yeah, and then at the IRS level, you can, it's a little complicated. There's a fee structure, but basically it's 20% of your overall budget can be devoted to this type of activity. And so they regulate it in a slightly different way. It's sort of budget regulation. And so take a look at the resources that I listed in the chat around how to do that accurately. I think the National Council of Nonprofits breaks down how you might compute that. But we often hear from nonprofits, particularly executive directors, that their boards told them they can't do a lick of this because it's illegal. And that's just not true. There's a lot of work that you can do in the 501c3 parameter. It's just really good to make sure that you're compliant around those parameters. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah, any other questions from the group? I would love to just understand who is actually already doing this work at the Capitol. Okay, so is everybody brand new gonna get out there this? Wow, it's exciting. Oh, okay. Yeah. Did you want to say something? Is it Lisa Louise?
Sure.
Yeah.
I just want to say that I have, being off island from the legislature, that I've submitted written testimony, and I'm wondering if you can talk about the importance of that over in person. Thank you.
Oh. I think in the wake of COVID, where we really wanted to facilitate as much participation, given that everybody was staying home, I think it's weighted equally. Robert might have a different opinion. He's a seasoned lobbyist as well in his career. But I think at the moment, because we also very much value Neighbor Island input, that bears just as much weight as somebody walking in and testifying. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Do you feel differently, Robert?
Well, first I have to say, beautiful cat. I'm in my office, but when I'm working from home, my cat frequently does the exact same thing. So I appreciate that. I feel like stuff that catches attention is really what's important. I first started volunteering with efforts to try to pass the bottle bill, the 5 cents on every bottle and can. And so we developed a kind of cool website, or found a website where people could email in and it automatically generated a fax. And so then we had hundreds of facts piled up on legislators' desk, and they were furious. Like, how dare you bombard me with all these faxes? And we were able to sweetly say, well, each one of these represents one of your constituents, and and it was really noticeable. And now, obviously, faxes are long dead, but everyone's now got email campaigns, so it's sort of normal to get 500 people submitting the exact same piece of testimony. It's just not that noticeable anymore. I mean, it's better than nothing, plainly, but I've seen legislators literally just highlight and delete and done. So written testimony that's individualized, specific, I think is more noticeable, that is researched, comes from a, if I were, I really love, Lisa and I have maybe very different experiences, and I feel like very complementary, I just want to be very clear, like, I'm not in any way trying to say mine's better, but, a lot of my advocacy and lobbying training has been about really focusing on the decision maker that you're trying to influence. And so if it's Senator so-and-so, you're going to be like, okay, who has the ability to influence that person? So it's going to be generally constituents, do they have a brother or sister? What organizations are they part of? And so you're just trying to figure out how to like get to their level of attention. So from an advertising campaign marketing, if you're kind of thinking that way, like what is it going to be that they're going to notice or pay attention to? So written testimony can absolutely be important, particularly if it's just well thought out and it's got something that's eye-catching. So as they're flipping through and looking at it, they're going to go, oh, hey, it's a picture of a cat. Like, I like cats. I'm gonna, right? It sounds silly, but that is going to be more noteworthy than just the standard form, I submit. I don't think those are as useful anymore.
Thank you very much.
Lisa, is it Lisa Louise or just Lisa? The session 2 of this series and 3 are going to focus on some of that, of
Perfect.
storytelling and testimony and navigating the legislative process. So please do come to those. I think you'll get a lot out of it. So
Thank you.
And Lisa and Robert, we do have a question in the chat from Michael Gleason. He's asking, is providing written testimony considered lobbying?
Again, it's going to go back to those factors we talked about. If you are submitting testimony to the legislature in this case, yes, on a bill, so yes. And if you're being paid to do so, so if it's sort of in your employed position, then yes, that's technically all, meeting the definition of a lobbyist. And then the next question we're going to ask is, did you spend the requisite number of hours or amount of time such that you now need to report? So if you were to submit testimony on one bill one time and you meet the other 3 conditions, chances are you probably didn't spend 5 hours to do so, and so you may not need to report. So again, it goes to 5 hours in a month. Lisa just pointing out 10 hours in a year, or spending more than $1,000. Some well-paid people, lucky them, for example, $1,000 may, looking at their salary, may come by pretty quickly, right? So, if you're paid $1 million a year, lucky you, a couple hours of your time may easily be $1,000. So again, there's all kind of things to factor in. Generally speaking, if you think you're going to be testifying a lot or sort of trying to be involved, I would encourage going ahead and registering. It's not that hard. And then even if there's years where you're just submitting 0, it's literally you log in, you push a button, and it's done. We also have, I really have to plug my office. We have an amazing staff, and they're really helpful and really supportive. So if you have questions, feel free to call on and interact with them. We have staff who will help walk you through the website and how to register and everything. And, amazing office. Very, very thrilled with everybody we have here.
are there any other questions as we kind of finish up our session 1 of this series? Well, as Robert has said, he's available anytime if any questions pop up, especially as it gets more relevant as we march toward legislative session. So feel free to call him anytime or email and his staff. And I'm available. I will be moderating the rest of this series. So if you think about a question, and I know a lot of you are going to continue on the series, we can chat about things in subsequent sessions. So if there isn't anything else from the group, thank you very much for your attention and your interest and your bravery in doing this work. Your missions are so important. I'm glad you're getting out there. So mahalo to all of you. And I'll punt this back to Gay to close us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Lisa. Big mahalo to you and to Robert for being our speakers for today. Just appreciate learning from your wisdom. And I want to thank everyone who has joined us. As a quick preview for our next session, that'll take place a week from today, part 2. Our topic is navigating the state legislative process. So we'll be meeting at the same time, same Zoom link. And we're excited that our House Speaker, Nadine Nakamura, will join, as well as Andy Langhurst from the Public Access Room. So until then, thank you so much for being with us. Keep advocating for the arts, and we will meet again 1 week from today. Take care, everyone. Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Mahalo.